Good night. Well, this is Ivan Amara. I'm going to make a very, very quick video about the Bible again. This will be maybe a 30-minute video, and that's it. Because I'm tired. After this video, I'm going to go to bed. Watch my video, then I'm going to go to bed, obviously. Yeah. I'm going to talk about Jesus' holiness in the Bible. As I interpret, when the Bible says Jesus was sinless, I interpret it to mean the nature more than the deeds. The deeds has a part to play with it. I agree. The Bible clearly teaches that sin has a part to play with deeds. Obviously, I agree with that. But the real battle is with the nature. It's not the deeds. Obviously, the deeds are a part of it, but the real battle is with the nature. That's where I see the Bible. Obviously, yeah. I'm sorry. Because I know most Christians interpret when it says Christ was sinless, it mainly means about his deeds. Like he never did a bad deed in his life. Nah, man, it's talking about his nature. It's not about the deeds. It's talking about his nature, not the deeds. The deeds has a part to play, but the real battle is with the nature. Christ came to save every human being who was touched by Adam's sinful DNA. He came to save them from their sinful nature. It's not about the deeds, mate. It's about the nature, man. It's not about the deeds. Deeds has a part to play, but it's mainly about the nature. The battles with the nature of the flesh, right? Yeah. Or see. Yeah. Why do you think in the Old Testament it says? Why do you think is it the Old Testament or New Testament? Why do you think in the Old Testament God says man's righteousness is as filthy rags? So it doesn't matter how good of a life you live, because your nature is tainted by sin. God sees you as a wicked person and you go to hell. It doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how good of a life you live. It's still not good enough because your nature is tainted with sin. Obviously. But because the human beings are touched by Adam's sin, it's impossible for them to live a righteous life. They're gonna, unless they're sealed by the Holy Spirit and they believe in Jesus, supposedly, obviously, because their nature is tainted by Adam's sin, they automatically will live a wicked life, obviously. But because Jesus had the holy DNA of the Father, even though he did bad deeds, it's impossible for him to live a wicked life compared to everyone else. He'll live a righteous life, but it doesn't mean he didn't do a bad deed. I'm sorry. So you don't interpret sin the way the Christians do. No, most Christians interpret Jesus never sinning means he never did a bad deed. I don't interpret that way. I interpret it that Jesus had the sinless nature of sinless DNA of the Father. And he did bad deeds, but he lived a righteous life compared to everyone else. He was the perfect man compared to everyone else, and his intentions were always good. His intentions were always to do righteous deeds. Hence, why he's sinless. But because he took on flesh and he had that constant struggle, sometimes he did bad deeds, obviously, because he took on flesh. He had the limitations of limitational weaknesses of the flesh. As Paul said, he was tempted like we are, obviously, at all points, yet without sin. But most Christians interpret tempted at all points like we are, without sin, means he never did bad deeds. It's not talking about the deeds. If you interpret without sin to mean deeds of passions, it makes no sense. So he was tempted like a human being, which means a woman had him, he had lustful thoughts towards this woman, hence he did the bad deed. And after that, he never did a bad deed after that. It doesn't make any sense. The passage makes no sense. He who knew no sin became sin for us. So he who never did a bad deed became a bad deed for us. That doesn't really make any sense if you interpret Jesus never sinning to mean bad deeds. It's talking about the nature. He who knew no sin, meaning his nature, as in the next passage it says, became sin for us. Jesus had the holy DNA of the Father. He had the holy sinless nature of the Father. And when he was on the cross, the full price of sin was put on his DNA. His nature became tainted with sin. He became sin. If you're interpreting sin to mean bad deeds, that means Jesus became a bad deed for us. It doesn't really make any sense. You guys see what I'm saying here? That's my point. Sounds odd, and I see what you're saying. Yeah. Jesus is sinless in the sense that his nature is holy and pure from the Father, and throughout his life his intentions were always good. And it's impossible for Jesus to live a wicked life because his nature was holy. He was a righteous man, obviously, but because he took on sin, he did bad deeds. But Christians interpret Jesus doing a bad deed as him sinning against the Father. I interpret it as Jesus had the holy name of the Father, obviously, hence he lived a righteous life, and his intentions were always righteous and good. But because he took on flesh, and he had the weaknesses of the flesh, obviously, temptations, he did do bad deeds. He lied, he probably swore, you know what I'm saying? He probably jacked off. He never touched a woman. I don't believe he touched a woman, obviously. But when he did do a bad deed, as I read in that passage, he would offer up vehement cries to the Father, and his intentions were always good, and the Father saw that as a sinless man. That's the way I see it. And that's how you know Jesus was a holy man. When he did do a bad deed, it got to him because his nature is holy, and he would cry heavy vehement tears to the Father because his intentions are always good to please the Father, and the Father sees it as a sinless, righteous man. The difference between Jesus and the sinner, obviously, the sinner's intentions is always to do bad. Obviously, Jesus' intentions were always good throughout his life. He always wanted to do the good. Because he took on flesh, he did do bad deeds. Do you think he messed up bad? No, he messed up a little bit. Like I messed up a little bit. He did bad deeds in his life, but compared to everyone else, he was perfect. Obviously, he became perfect by the crucifixion. Jesus became a perfect man. It says he grew in wisdom and stature and knowledge. Obviously, when you read that passage, right? That's another good passage. Obviously, yeah. It says, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience through things which he suffered. Notice how, if Paul were he made that qualification. Though Jesus was the Son of God, he had the holy name of the Father, he learned obedience throughout his life. But most Christians interpret that to mean the crucifixion. But in the crucifixion, he was obedient to the Father. Because at that point, by the crucifixion, Jesus was already perfected, obviously. He was obedient to the Father. Yes, he had his doubts, obviously. He had his human weakness limitations, but he submitted his will to the Father. And it's not talking about the crucifixion. A part of it's about the crucifixion, obviously. He suffered the crucifixion, but Jesus was obedient when he went to the cross. And he said, not my will, but your will be done. Jesus submitted his will to the Father. He was obedient there. So it's not talking about that passage. And show me one verse in the New Testament where Jesus offers up vehement crying praise to the Father. I believe the New Testament authors left that out. There's certain things in Jesus' life they didn't want to record, supposedly, right? As it says in John, there's many deeds and miracles that Jesus did that are not recorded in the Gospels. I believe the Gospels focus on the good stuff of Jesus' life, but the bad they left out. Some of the bad. Do you believe Jesus messed up bad? No, he didn't mess up bad, but he did bad deeds. That's my point. Obviously, some saying. So he has a sinless nature of the Father, which means it's impossible for him to live a wicked life. Because he took on human flesh, he did do bad deeds, obviously. But even though he did the bad deeds, his intentions were always good. Always to please the Father. Hence why when he did do a bad deed, he would offer vehement cries, prayers to the Father. It says, though he was a son, he learned obedience through things which he suffered. He suffered in his life, obviously. And he became perfected by, I don't know, the crucifixion or the resurrection. You know, I mean, he was perfected at the resurrection. But if you say he's perfected at the resurrection, that means before that he wasn't perfected. You still have your dilemma there, right? Yeah. That's my point, Sarah. Sounds like you're gifted. You know how to blow our mind away. Yeah, I know how to blow your mind away. I'm gifted at apologetics. Obviously. You know, I mean, maybe this whole thing about Jesus never doing a bad deed, maybe it's bullshit. I call it bullshit, man. In the Old Testament, as God, he did bad deeds. So what makes you think as a man he won't do bad deeds? Of course he will, man. He's going to do bad deeds. But compared to everyone else, he was a righteous man. Obviously, some sinner. His intentions were always to do good, because his nature's holy. But he took on flesh, which means he did do bad deeds, obviously. Yeah. Yeah, but all right, if you're saying Jesus is a bad deed, that means he failed. I'm like, yeah, because you guys take Jesus' righteousness to the extreme whereby he never did one bad deed in his whole life, man. Come on, guys, man. He was a human being. He did bad deeds, obviously, as it says in that passage in Paul. He was tempered like we are, yet without sin. But most Christians interpret without sin to mean he never did a bad deed. But if you say he never did a bad deed in that passage, the passage doesn't make any sense. He was tempted like we are, which means a woman hit on him. He had those lustful thoughts, which means he did do the bad deed. As if when Jesus says you look upon a woman and lust after in your heart, that means if you think about banging the chick, you already lusted after in your heart. Hence, Jesus, if you sound like we're, he must have thought those thoughts, which means he did the bad deed. And after that, he never did a bad deed after that. It doesn't make any sense. I interpret without sin to mean the nature. Jesus has the holy DNA of the Father, obviously. And in John 8:46, Sam knows this verse, obviously. Jesus says, which one of you convicts me of sin? Obviously. But most Christians will interpret that to mean Jesus' deeds in his life. I interpret it to mean the nature. Because before Jesus took on flesh, he did do the bad deed. So if you interpret sin to mean bad deed, now you have a contradiction in that passage. Which one of you guys convicts me of sin? Which one of you guys convict me of ever doing a bad deed? But in the Old Testament, even though Jesus was a righteous judge, obviously, he did do the bad deed. As in the Old Testament, it says that if you thou shalt not commit murder, but Jesus did murder people in the Old Testament. He did the bad deed. So if you interpret that passage to mean Jesus, which one of you convicts me of sin, means that which one of you convicts me of doing a bad deed in my life, you have a problem there, because in the Old Testament, Jesus did do many bad deeds in the Old Testament. And yet he didn't sin, right? So how do you reconcile that passage, Christians? If you got us, yeah, man. I'm like, give me a ball, Jack. I know how to blow your mind away. Amen. His intentions were always good. That's why he's sinless. Obviously. The sinless means his nature, obviously. But in terms of the deeds, Jesus' intentions were always to do good, to please the Father. Whereas the human beings who were touched by Adam's sin, their intentions are always to do bad. Obviously. Though their intentions are to do good, but they can't do good. They always do the bad because they have the sinful nature of Adam. Whereas Jesus' intentions were always to do righteous things, to do good. Because he took on flesh, corrupted flesh, obviously, he did do bad deeds. He was a human being. But compared to everyone else, he lived a perfect life. You guys see what I'm saying? Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. So why, if Jesus lied, if Jesus swore, if Jesus thought lustful thoughts towards a woman, if Jesus thought murderous thoughts, angry thoughts towards the Pharisees and all that stuff, it would affect him, yes. Because he's holy, it affects him, and he's in constant vehement cries and communication with the Father, and his intentions are always good. And the Father sees that as a sinless, righteous man. He sees Jesus as a sinless, righteous man mainly because of his nature. Because when the Father sees Jesus, he sees himself, obviously. But in terms of the deeds, his intentions are always to do good. And he's in constant, vehement cries and prayers to the Father if he does do a bad deed. And the Father sees that as a righteous man. But Christians interpret, no, Ivan. Jesus never did one bad deed. He never even thought one bad thought. Well, if you're saying he's truly human, then I don't think Jesus is truly human if he never thought a bad thought towards people, man. Of course he did. And he did lust after a woman in his own heart, as I proved you in that passage, right? He was tempted at all points like we are, yet without sin. But most Christians interpret tempted at all points like we are, yet without sin means Jesus was tempted, but he didn't think the bad thought. If you're saying he's tempted and he didn't think the bad thought, that means he wasn't tempted to begin with. Hence, why is Paul, if you wrote Hebrews, saying he was tempted if he wasn't really tempted to begin with? And he wasn't tempted like where you contradict Paul. And then without sin means he never did the bad deed. So he was tempted, but he didn't think the lustful thoughts towards the woman, which means he wasn't tempted like we are, and he wasn't really tempted to begin with. Hence, what's the point of Paul saying without sin if he wasn't really tempted to begin with? He never did the bad deed. It doesn't make any sense, man. Whereas if you interpret without sin to be nature, the passage makes sense. Yeah, he was a human being. He was tempted like we are. He did think lust was a woman. But there was no sin in his nature. He had the holy name of the Father, obviously. So even though Jesus did think it was also towards those women, it was his human nature. Obviously, it was his human nature, but his divine nature always wanted to do the good. Yeah, I'm not. Even though I thought this was towards a woman, I'm never gonna touch this chick. His intentions are always good. If I have a boner, I'm not gonna bang this woman. It's not my intentions. It's just my human nature battling with my divine holy nature, and I'm not gonna do it. His intentions are always good, and it gets to him. It gets to his spirit. Obviously, there's passion in the Bible where Jesus says Jesus groaned in his spirit. Yeah, it gets to him, and he has vehement cries to the Father. There's no evidence that Jesus had vehement cries to the Father. Well, it says in the days of his flesh, he offered up vehement cries and prayers to him who was able to save from death. He was heard because of his godly fear. But why would Jesus have a godly fear if he never did a bad deed in his life? If Jesus never did a bad deed in his life, why would he have a godly fear? There's nothing to fear if you know you're never going to do a bad deed, right? But it says he was heard because of his godly fear. He had a godly fear. And it says in the days of his flesh. Most people interpret that passage to mean the crucifixion. But the crucifixion was a 12-hour event. It says in the days, plural, of his flesh. He offered up vehement cries and prayers to him who was able to save from death. Some Sarah. So it's talking about his life. Jesus' life. Yeah. Talking about his life. Yeah. Yeah. It can't talk about the crucifixion because Christ was obedient when he went to the cross. Obviously, he did cry in the agony, but no, if you read the Gospels, nowhere does it say Jesus cried when he prayed to the Father when he was in agony at the Garden of Gethsemane. He might have cried, but the text is not really explicit saying that he cried, right? You have that. And Jesus was obedient when he went to the cross. When you read the Bible, he says, not my will, but your will, Father. He was obedient there. So it's not talking about the crucifixion there. It's talking about something deep that happened in Jesus' life. Something deep that happened in Jesus' life, obviously. That's not recorded in the Gospels. That's where I see it. There's no one in the Gospels where you see it say that Jesus cried vehement tears to the Father. It just says he prayed, but nowhere does it say he's crying vehement tears to the Father. I think the Gospel writers left that out because they don't want you to focus on the sufferings of Jesus' life. They want you to focus on the good things Jesus did. Christ suffered in his life. He learned obedience through the things which he suffered. Though he was a son, he learned obedience through the things which he suffered, and he became perfected. Well, how can you be perfected if you're already perfect, man? I mean, it's an exaggeration. I don't think so, man. I think it's very clear that he suffered his life, Jesus. Yeah, I don't think it's an exaggeration, man. Or like, what? Yeah. Figurative language. I think it's literal. I think he did suffer in his life, Jesus. But it's not recorded in the Gospels as I showed you guys in my past videos right now. This video won't be long, guys. I'll make maybe a 25-minute video because it's getting late. I have work tomorrow at 8:30. So I'm gonna upload this video, then I'm gonna watch the show with you guys, and I'm gonna go to listen to some music and go to bed. I'm fucking tired. Yeah. You really know how Laura Mino. Yeah, I know most Christians don't agree. I'm sorry, I don't agree with you, man. If you're saying that Jesus did about it, he failed. Not stuff. Well, you got to be consistent, man. In the Old Testament, Jesus told Moses, if you murder anyone, you committed sin. Yet he's committing the very act that he commanded Moses and the Israelites not to commit. Did Jesus sin there? No, he didn't. Well, then be consistent, man. You can't be inconsistently arguing as Christians. That's all I'm going to say, man. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Yeah, but I think God has every right to God is the author of life. He has every right to take away life. I agree, but the fact is that that's not the point. The point is he put in the law, thou shalt not murder, and yet if you murder, you're breaking God's law. But then God is murdering people, a lot of people in the Old Testament, and yet he's still a righteous judge, a righteous God. Why is Jesus all of a sudden unrighteous if he does bad deeds in his life? When he takes on flesh, his intentions are always good to do good, and when he does do a bad deed, he's in vehement prayer. He groans in his spirit. He's in vehement prayer to the Father, and the Father sees Jesus as the Father means sees Jesus as a righteous man because he has a holy name, the Father. And in terms of his deeds, he sees the perfect man because Jesus is in constant communication with the Father. If he does a bad deed, he's in vehement cries and tears, heavy, passionate cries to the Father when he does do a bad deed. And that's how holy Jesus is. Yeah, when he did a bad deed, it got to him. And he would get down on these and be in constant prayer and have heavy crying tears to the Father. Because he had a godly fear. And the Father sees it as a righteous man. Mainly because of his nature. But the deeds has a part to play. Jesus' intentions were always good. He always had good intentions. He always wanted to do the good. And he did do the good, but it doesn't mean he didn't do any bad deeds, right? Whereas a sinner, even though they try to do good, their intentions are always to do bad because they have the wicked DNA of the sinful DNA of Adam and Eve. That's the difference between the sinners and Jesus, obviously. So why you believe deeds has a part to play with sin? Of course it does. The Bible clearly teaches that deeds has a part to play with sin. But the real battle is with the nature. As it says, man's righteousness are as filthy rags. Doesn't matter how good you are. Yeah, doesn't matter how good you are. God still sees you as a sinner because your nature is tainted by Adam's sin. Whereas Jesus' nature was not touched by Adam's sin because he came from the Father. He has a holy. He's the holy begotten Son of the Father. He has a Father's DNA. The light, the Father sees the beautiful holy light in the DNA, whereas the human beings, it's like black, tainted with sin. That's the difference, obviously. That's why Jesus was a sufficient sacrifice for the sins of the world, because he had the Father's DNA, holy and pure. So you don't interpret sin, Jesus being sinners to mean his deeds. Deeds has a part to play with it. I interpret it to mean the nature. It's not the deeds. As it says, he who knew no sin became sin for us. So he who never did a bad deed became a bad deed for us. Does that really make any sense, guys? It doesn't really make any sense. Whereas if you interpret to mean nature, it makes sense. He who was holy, holy DNA of the Father, became tainted with sin for us. Jesus' nature became tainted with sin when he died on the cross, supposedly. Obviously. Yeah. Sincere? Because if you interpret it to mean deeds, so every single bad deed that everyone did in their life was put on Jesus, does that really make any sense? Or it makes more sense that his nature was holy and the full price of sin was put on, the full weight of sin was put on his body. Obviously. On his flesh. On his DNA. His DNA became tainted with sin. That's how he was able to pay the debt. That makes more sense. Whereas saying that all the deeds of past, present, future put on Jesus doesn't really make any sense. Like, can you put a deed on a body? It doesn't really make any sense, man. That's why I don't believe in the Jesus being sentenced to mean he never did right. I believe it. I interpret it to mean a nature. But because his nature is holy, he did live a holy, good life. Perfect life compared to everyone else. But it doesn't mean he didn't do any bad deeds, obviously. That's why I see it. I told you, if I taught this in the church, this is a very radical view of Jesus. If I taught this in the church, Sam Shrew and David Wood and all of them would call me a heretic. Yeah, you're a heretic. I don't believe in that, man. You're teaching a heretical doctrine, yeah. So be consistent, guys. It's heresy when Jesus takes on flesh to do a bad deed, but when he's God and he murders people, that's not heresy. That's righteous judgment. And he's a holy God. Yeah, Christians are very inconsistent with their arguments. That's all I gotta do, man. If I debated a Christian on this topic, and they played that heresy game. I can find verses in the Old Testament when the angel of Yahweh, because Jesus was the God of the Old Testament when it came to Moses. That was Jesus. He was the angel of Yahweh. He's the one who gave the Ten Commandments. Yeah. As when you read in the burning bush scene, it says the angel of Yahweh spoke to Moses. It doesn't say Yahweh, it says the angel of the Lord spoke to Moses. And later on, you find out the angel's also God. That was Jesus in the burning bush with Moses. And he murdered all the what? Pharaoh and the Egyptians, right? Yeah. He did a bad deed, right? So if you interpret sin to mean bad deeds, how do you reconcile that, guys, with Jesus doing bad deeds in the Old Testament? Yes, he's a righteous judge, but he still did the bad deed, right? So when Jesus said, "Who here convicts me of sin?" even though his audience didn't really know he was an angel Lord in the Old Testament, Jesus knew full well what he did in the Old Testament. He murdered people, man. So which one of you guys convicts me of doing a bad deed? I interpreted which one of you... The demons has a part to play, obviously, in that scene. But I interpreted to mean which one of you convicts me of being tainted by Adam's sin. No, Jesus is the only one who's not tainted by Adam's sin. Because he comes from the Father. He has a holy meaning of the Father. That's the way I see it. I'm sorry. Yeah. Obviously. Before I show this calf here, in that scene, I forget the passage. I believe, I forget what the passage. I called this passage before. The scene when Jesus gets out of the boat, and there's a man possessed by legions, right? And then there's a man possessed by legions, obviously, and then the man, he's very powerful, obviously, and the man comes to try to destroy Jesus, right? And then they stop, and then the man stops, and they said, "We know who you are. You are the Holy One of God." So the demons recognize Jesus because of his good deeds, or they recognize him because of his holy nature. They recognize him because of his holy nature. They sense his presence. When from far away, they didn't know, but because, why? How do the demons know? Because demons are spiritual beings. They can see through the veil. The human beings can't see through the veil. When they see Jesus, he looks like an ordinary Jew. But the demons can see through the veil. When they looked through the veil, they saw the Son of God indwelt in that body, obviously, and they can sense his holy presence from the Father. That's why it said, "We know who you are. You are the Holy One of God." When they call him the Holy One of God, were they talking about his deeds, or were they talking about his presence, his holy nature, his holy presence from the Father, his holy divine presence? They're talking about his presence, his holy divine presence, his DNA in that flesh. They can see through the veil. That's how the demons knew. So you could make a case. I know most Christians disagree with me on this. You can make a case that when the Bible says Jesus sins, it's talking mainly about his nature. Because the demons called him holy by sensing his nature. Not his deeds, man. It wasn't the deeds, it was his nature. They sense his nature. Yes, it's debatable. I understand. Yes, I know Christians can bring arguments. There's some passages in the Bible where Christians can perhaps refute me on this. I want to be humble here about the deeds, but I think it has mainly to do about the nature. That's my opinion, obviously. So I hope you guys learned from my quick video. This is a 29-minute video. Hope you guys enjoy this show. Stay tuned. I'll make a video tomorrow after my shift at my daunting shift at over 40. This is Ivan Rare. I hope you guys enjoyed this amazing apologetics video from Ivan Rare. Peace out, guys. Hope you guys just learn a little bit from what I showed you. Peace.